I used to believe that my life was a tapestry woven with two threads, my hands and his dream. For 22 years, that was the only truth I knew. My name is Eliza, and for 22 years, my world was a small cafe called The Daily Grind. It wasn't just a business, it was a living, breathing thing that we had built from nothing. I say we, but the reality is that I was the mortar and he, David, was the architect. Or so I thought. My days began before the sun, in the cool, quiet dark of the kitchen. The smell of yeast and sugar was my air, the rhythm of kneading dough my heartbeat. I knew the exact moment the croissants turned the perfect shade of gold, the precise temperature for a flawless crème brûlée. My hands, they were never clean. They were perpetually dusted with flour, stained with berry juice, scarred with small, pale burns from the ovens. They were the hands of a creator, a nurturer. I poured my soul into that place. Every recipe was a piece of me, every satisfied customer a validation of my sacrifice. I'd given up my own small dream of being an illustrator to support his grand vision. I convinced myself that his dream was big enough for the both of us. Our life was a comfortable, predictable routine. I would bake, he would manage the front of the house, charming the regulars with his easy smile. In the evenings, we'd sit together, exhausted but content, counting the day's earnings and planning for the future. He'd talk about franchising, about opening a second location, and I would nod along, my mind already on the next day's batch of sourdough. I loved him, or, at least, I loved the man I had built him up to be in my mind. He was my partner, my world. I had willingly made myself small so that he could be big, believing that his light would shine on us both. The day it all shattered was a Tuesday, the 10th anniversary of The Daily Grind. We were hosting a small party for our most loyal customers and friends. The cafe was buzzing, filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses. I had spent a week creating the centerpiece, a magnificent, three-tiered cake decorated with intricate sugar flowers that mirrored the ones in our small garden. I remember feeling a rare, uncomplicated flicker of pride as I looked at it. David tapped a glass for a toast. He stood in the center of the room, beaming, bathed in the warm glow of the cafe lights. I stood by the counter, wiping a smudge of chocolate from my apron, my heart swelling. Friends, family, he began, his voice booming with the confidence I had helped build. 10 years. 10 years ago, I had a dream. He paused, and everyone smiled, looking at me. I felt a blush creep up my neck. I expected him to thank me, to acknowledge the partnership. But his eyes didn't meet mine. They scanned the room and landed on a young woman near the front, our new waitress, Clara. I built this place with a vision of what my life could be, he continued. And for a long time, I thought that vision was complete. But recently, I've realized a foundation is just a foundation. You need the right person to build a house with. The room was silent now, the smiles frozen on people's faces. My own smile felt like a cracking mask. He reached out and took Clara's hand. She was young, barely 21, all bright eyes and unlined skin. Clara has shown me what real passion is. She has inspired me to finally build the life I was meant to have. He looked at me then for the first time. There was no apology in his eyes, no sadness. There was only a cold, hard finality. Eliza and I will be going our separate ways. The cafe was always my venture, and I'll be starting fresh, with a fresh perspective. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. My venture. The words echoed in my skull, drowning out the frantic beating of my heart. The flour on my hands suddenly felt like dirt. The burns on my arms began to throb. I looked around at the faces of our friends, our customers. I saw pity, I saw shock, I saw a horrifying, stomach-churning curiosity. I was no longer Eliza, the heart of the daily grind. I was a spectacle. A woman discarded in public, replaced by a younger model, my 2 decades of labor erased in a single, cruel speech. He had not just left me, he had publicly fired me from the life I had built. He had taken my story and edited me out of it. I remember the silence, then the awkward, shuffling whispers. No one knew what to say. I just stood there, my hands clenched at my sides, the beautiful cake on the counter looking like a monument to my own stupidity. At that moment, my world vanished. It was the deepest pain I had ever felt. If you've ever gone through a great disappointment and understand what it's like to have your heart broken, Please like this video so I know I'm not alone on this journey. The weeks that followed are a blur of gray. He was true to his word. The locks were changed. My name was removed from the business accounts, something my lawyer later told me was easy for him to do since I had trusted him to handle all the paperwork years ago. I had built a home and a business, but I owned nothing. I was left with a few boxes of personal belongings and a chasm where my life used to be. I stayed on my sister's couch, a ghost haunting her small apartment. For the first time in 22 years, I had nowhere to be at 4 a.m. My hands, once so purposeful, were now idle and soft. They felt alien, useless. I would wake up in the dark, my body still wired to the old rhythm, and the realization that there was no dough to knead, no ovens to preheat, would hit me with the force of a physical blow. The darkness was absolute. It wasn't just sadness, it was a complete erasure of self. Who was I if I wasn't David's wife? Who was I if I wasn't the baker at the daily grind? I had no answers. I spent my days staring at the ceiling, replaying his speech over and over in my head, each word a fresh cut. I felt like a discarded ingredient, left to spoil on the counter. My sister tried her best, bringing me tea and soup that I rarely touched. Friends called, but their well-meaning platitudes felt like stones being thrown at me. "You're strong," they'd say. "You'll get through this." But I didn't feel strong. I felt hollowed out, a fragile shell that could be crushed by a single unkind word. My savings dwindled. The small amount of money he'd given me as a severance was an insult, and it disappeared quickly. I tried looking for jobs, but what could I put on a resume? Baked croissants for 22 years in a business I no longer own. I was 45 years old, with no formal qualifications and a 20-year gap in my employment history. The world felt impossibly large and unforgiving. One afternoon, consumed by a despair so heavy it felt like I was drowning, I found myself walking aimlessly. I ended up in a part of town I didn't recognize, in front of a small, ancient-looking church. I wasn't a religious person. I hadn't been to church since I was a child. But I was desperate for something, for some kind of sign or absolution. I didn't even know what I wanted to be absolved of, maybe for being so foolish, for giving my life away so completely. I saw a sign for confession, and, on an impulse I still don't understand, I walked inside. The confessional was dark and smelled of old wood and incense. I knelt, my voice a broken whisper, as I told the silhouetted priest not my sins, but my sorrow. I told him everything. My life, the cafe, the betrayal, the emptiness. When I finished, there was a long silence. I expected a prayer, a penance. Instead, a tired, gravelly voice said something I would never forget. "My child, the pain you feel is real. But your story is not over. The truth is written, but not by me." His words were cryptic, strange. They offered no comfort, only confusion. I left the church feeling even more lost than before. 3 days later, a package arrived at my sister's apartment. It was a small, heavy box with no return address. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, was a Bible. It wasn't a new Bible. It was old, the leather cover worn smooth with age, the pages yellowed and fragile. I almost dismissed it as some strange follow-up from the church, but then I saw the faint, gold leaf inscription on the cover. Eliza May Crawford. My grandmother's name. It was her Bible, the one I thought had been lost years ago after she passed. My hands trembled as I opened it. And that's when I saw it. Tucked between the pages, written in the margins in my grandmother's elegant, fading script, were notes. But they weren't religious annotations. They were recipes. Hidden in the book of Genesis was a detailed method for a complex, 7-grain sourdough starter. Tucked into Psalms were instructions for a honey and lavender cake. In Proverbs, a recipe for a spiced bread that she called courage loaf. My grandmother, a woman I remembered as quiet and pious, had been a baker, a secret artist. She had hidden her life's work, her passion, her truth, within the pages of the holiest of books. It was a legacy I never knew I had. As I read her notes, I felt a spark, a tiny, fragile flicker in the vast darkness of my despair. The truth is written, but not by me. The priest's words came back to me. The truth wasn't in the printed scripture. It was in the handwritten notes in the margins. It was my truth, my history, my inheritance. And for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. That old Bible became my new blueprint. The couch in my sister's living room transformed into my headquarters. I didn't have a state-of-the-art kitchen anymore. I had her tiny, cramped oven and a couple of mixing bowls. But I had my grandmother's words, and I had my hands. The work was grueling. It was a journey back in time, deciphering her cursive, understanding her measurements that were often described in pinches and handfuls rather than grams. The first attempt at her courage loaf was a disaster, a dense, burnt brick that I threw away in tears of frustration. I was starting from less than zero. I had no money for fancy ingredients, so I learned to be resourceful. I made friends with a local farmer at the market who gave me bruised fruit for my jams and sold me flour at a discount. My sister gave me her grocery budget for a week, so I could afford good yeast. Every penny I had went into this new, fragile venture. There were days I wanted to give up. Days when the loneliness was so profound, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I missed the sounds of the cafe, the easy rhythm of my old life. But then I would open the Bible, smell the old paper, and read my grandmother's notes. She wrote not just about ingredients, but about how baking was a form of prayer, a way to pour your love into something tangible. This bread, she wrote beside one recipe, is for when the world feels cold. It will warm you from the inside out. I wasn't just following recipes. I was in a silent conversation with a woman I barely knew, but whose spirit felt more present than anyone else in my life. I poured my anger, my grief, and my desperate hope into the dough. I kneaded until my arms ached, until the sorrow in my heart began to soften and yield, just like the gluten strands I was working. After weeks of trial and error, I finally baked a perfect loaf of courage bread. The crust was deep brown and crackled when I touched it. The inside was soft and aromatic with spices I couldn't even name. I sat at my sister's kitchen table and ate a slice while it was still warm, and I cried. They weren't tears of sadness this time. They were tears of creation, of accomplishment. I had made something beautiful out of my own brokenness. My first victory was small, almost comically so. My sister convinced me to take a few loaves of my bread to a small weekend farmer's market. I set up a tiny card table with a checkered cloth, my few loaves wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. I felt exposed, vulnerable. People walked by, their eyes gliding over my humble display on their way to the more established vendors. For hours, I sold nothing. Just as I was about to pack up, defeated, an elderly woman stopped. She picked up a loaf of the honey and lavender cake, sniffing it delicately. My mother used to make something that smelled like this, she said, her voice wistful. She bought it without even asking the price. I watched her walk away, my heart pounding. An hour later, she came back. "Young lady," she said, her eyes shining. That was not a cake. That was a memory. She bought 2 more loaves and pressed a $20 bill into my hand. "Don't you dare stop making this," she commanded gently. That small moment was everything. It was the first money I had earned on my own. It was the first acknowledgement that what I was doing had value. I had helped someone, not by being an assistant to a man's dream, but by sharing my own inherited gift. I went back to that market every weekend. I started with a few loaves, then a dozen, then I was selling out within the first 2 hours. People started calling me the Bible Baker. They came for the bread, but they stayed for the story, which I began to share in small pieces. They were drawn to the idea of recipes passed down through generations, of finding a new life in an old book. My little table became a point of connection. People would tell me their own stories of loss and recovery as they bought my courage loaf. I was no longer just a baker. I was a keeper of stories, a merchant of hope. The turning point came when a local food blogger wrote a piece about me. She called my stall the most soulful spot in the city. The article went viral overnight. Suddenly, my phone was ringing. Cafes and restaurants wanted to carry my bread. I was getting emails from people across the country asking if I shipped my products. I had gone from invisible to in demand. It was terrifying and exhilarating. With a small loan from a women's entrepreneurship fund, I moved from my sister's couch into a small apartment and rented a commercial kitchen space. It wasn't fancy like the daily grind, but it was all mine. The long hours, the exhaustion, the constant pressure, it was all worth it. I was building something that could not be taken away from me, because its foundation was my own resilience. It was there, with my own hands, that I began to rewrite my story. I stopped being the victim and became the author of my own destiny. If my comeback journey is inspiring you, subscribe to the channel to follow the next chapters and be part of this community of new beginnings. Life settled into a new, beautiful rhythm. My business, which I named Margin Notes, grew steadily. I hired my first employee, a young woman who had just gone through a difficult divorce and needed a fresh start. Together, we filled the city with a scent of honest, soulful baking. I finally felt a sense of peace, a quiet confidence that had been alien to me for so long. And then, one rainy afternoon, the past walked through the door of my kitchen. It was David. He looked different, thinner, with shadows under his eyes. The easy charm had been replaced by a weary desperation. He stood there awkwardly, dripping water onto the clean floor, looking at the racks of cooling bread, the bags of flour, the bustling activity. He was a tourist in the world I had built. "Eliza," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I heard you were doing well." I didn't stop what I was doing. I continued shaping a loaf of dough on the floured countertop, my movements steady and sure. "Hello, David." I didn't offer him a seat. I didn't offer him a kind word. I just offered him the neutral space of my attention. He rambled for a while. The daily grind was struggling. Clara had left him. He had made a terrible mistake. The words were the ones I had once longed to hear, but now they felt hollow, meaningless. They were about him, his regret, his needs. He finally got to the point. "I was thinking," he said, trying to force a smile. "Maybe we could partner up. You're baking my business sense. We were always a great team." I stopped kneading then. I wiped my hands on my apron, leaving white streaks on the dark fabric, a map of my labor. I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since he'd walked in. The big, impressive man I had once loved now just looked small. The power he held over me was gone, evaporated in the heat of my new ovens. "We were never a team, David," I said, my voice even and calm. There was no anger, no bitterness. Only a quiet, unshakable truth. A team implies mutual respect. You had an employee you didn't pay, and a wife you didn't value. I was convenient, until I wasn't. He flinched. "Eliza, I'm sorry, I know you are," I interrupted softly. "You're sorry because your plan didn't work out. But my new life, this place, it was built on the ruins of the one you destroyed. It was watered with my tears and built with a strength you never knew I had. A strength I didn't even know I had. This foundation is mine alone." He looked around my kitchen again, at the warmth, the life, the success. He saw what he had thrown away, but he didn't understand what he was truly looking at. He was looking at my legacy, born from my grandmother's secrets. "The truth," I told him, thinking of the priest in the dark confessional, "is that my story was always written. I just had to learn to read the margins." I pointed to the door. "You should go." He left without another word. As the door closed behind him, I felt no triumph, no desire for revenge. I just felt peace. I had faced my past not as a victim, but as a survivor who had written her own, much better, ending. Today, my life is full. Margin Notes has expanded. I have a small storefront now, and we host workshops for women who are trying to rebuild their own lives. We teach them how to bake, yes, but we also teach them how to find the recipes hidden in their own stories. My hands are still covered in flour, still marked with the small, pale scars of my work. But now when I look at them, I see strength. I see the hands of my grandmother. I see the hands of a woman who built her world from scratch, twice. The old Bible sits on a special shelf in my office. It's a reminder that sometimes the most profound truths aren't in the main text of our lives, but in the notes we scribble in the margins, in the secrets we pass down, in the strength we inherit without even knowing it. The priest was right. The truth was written, but it wasn't his to give. It was mine to discover. It was the story of my own resilience, a story that began not with a betrayal, but with the love of a woman who hid recipes in the book of Genesis. I learned that the end of one story is often just the messy, painful, and necessary beginning of a better one. Today, I understand that the wounds of the past don't define who we are, but what we do with them does. I am immensely grateful that you have listened to my story this far. If it has touched you, share it with someone who needs a light, and leave a comment with a word of strength and hope. Together, we are stronger.